good. All right, thank you all for joining us, and I'm sorry about the 3-minute lag, but I'm pretty sure we can make it up throughout the course of the hour. Just to reintroduce sort of the series of webinars that we're doing, this is one in a series of webinars to support the ongoing work that the Lakeshore region is doing for knowledge services. So essentially implementing an analytic system and just starting to use data and analysis as part of the overall organizational strategy and day-to-day management of the organizations that each of you run and work at. So today's webinar is about data culture. And I think, so some of these have been more or less technical. We've gone over, for instance, measure specifications. We've gone over sort of the overall strategy of quality measures in the healthcare and behavioral healthcare environment. We've gone over, in our last meeting, sort of how to ask good questions and some of the pitfalls in thinking that people tend to fall into related to using data in an organization. And today we are going to dive into the subject of developing a data culture. So our first step in this discussion, because this is a lunchtime webinar and presumably you are all on some kind of break from very hard work that happens before and after the webinar, we're going to start off with a story today. And today's story is a little story about a hedgehog and a fox. And the story, before you get your hopes way up, is based on some research done by a scholar named Philip E. Tetlock. And what he basically did is he said, all right, he finally got tenure at a college. And he was like, you know what, I got tenure, I can start asking the questions I really want to ask. And the questions that he really wanted to ask were, are political and strategic analysts' predictions right? And what can we say with any sort of confidence about the likelihood that their predictions are correct or not, right? I mean, I think all of us who have watched television have sort of seen pundits sort of make pronouncements like, oh, this is definitely what's going to happen, or this is definitely what's going to happen. So what he did is he actually gathered together all of the forecasts from 284 different experts, over 28,000 forecasts, predictions that these experts made, and then retrospectively, he sort of looked back and he said, like, all right, when they were right, was there a pattern there? Is there anything that we can say fits with the likelihood of being right as an analyst? And he really only found one pattern that emerged consistently, and that's what led him to sort of describe this story, essentially, of the hedgehog and the fox. And the moral of this story, like if it was an Aesop's fable, the moral of the story would be how you think matters more than what you think. And the hedgehog and the fox are really ways of describing two basic patterns of human thinking. And the hedgehog, which you will probably recognize certain attributes of yourself and of others. It's kind of like the DSM. Once you find it, you start diagnosing everybody you know. So be a little bit wary about that. But here's the basic breakdown of how he tried to characterize the different types of analysts who would make these predictions. He said there's this one group which he called the hedgehogs. And he said the hedgehogs are sort of the types of thinkers that have one large theory that they tend to apply to every single problem, right? So, you know, whether that's somebody of a particular political persuasion, if it's somebody who always boils things down to dollars and cents, that there's one sort of lens that they tend to see the world through, and they're always looking at it through that lens. They apply it to many domains, And they tend to express their views with a lot of confidence. Like, you don't hear a lot of words like maybe or if. You don't hear a lot of those sort of conditional statements in the hedgehog's claims. And this really reminds, at least me, of most people who you would hear talk on television, right? So if you're talking to somebody who's an expert, they'll usually sort of assume, I'm an expert. I have to say things with some level of certainty, and tends to make statements that sort of overreach the actual facts that are at hand. And a lot of times they'll sort of impose a formulaic solution on ill-defined problems, right? So if somebody gets asked a question like, how are we doing financially this month? Or like, how's the organization doing? That's a really ill-defined question. It's a really ill-defined problem. And yet, somebody who's in charge of, who's sort of the specialist in knowing about that, will tend to answer it fairly confidently with a brief sentence and not really say, all right, however, there are these other things that we're looking at. So there will be a really formulaic approach to answering that question. So that's our first character, the hedgehog. Our next character is the fox, and the fox is sort of polar opposite. Skeptical about any one big theory being applied to everything. The fox tends to draw from multiple different areas of knowledge. You know, so for the fox, a room full of hedgehogs is like a buffet, right? Because you get to sort of sit there and say, oh, I have all these different viewpoints. I can sort of sample what's best from each of them and apply those to the situation. They're not tied to one particular way of looking at the world if it doesn't fit with the facts of the situation. And they also tend to be a lot more guarded in their forecasts, which makes them less good as TV show hosts or guests, but a lot more accurate in terms of their predictions. Like they'll tend to say, however, or if this happens, and sort of hedge their responses and put some conditionals in there. And finally, they're ready to adjust their ideas based on new information or new events. So one thing that's worth saying, while all of you are trying to classify everyone who you know as either a hedgehog or a fox, is that really, I'm guessing that most of us have both of these sort of characters inside of us, right? So we have one on one shoulder, one on the other shoulder. Also, I think another thing that's worth pointing out at this point is there's also, I think, a like drive that people might have to say, oh, I'd like to say that CEOs are always hedgehogs and analysts, you know, or like, you know, data scientists are always foxes. And that's not true either by any extent. I mean, I've met plenty of CEOs who have a very sort of foxy approach to coming up with answers and developing strategies. And I've met plenty of people who, you know, were doing sort of down in the trenches, point of service work, who tend to see things in sort of very stark us versus them, management versus staff viewpoints. So you can have hedgehogs and foxes in multiple types of positions throughout the organization. But one thing that we wanted to make sure that we were asking the question about, and we're bringing this up in the beginning of this webinar because I think it's a helpful way to think about the way that your organizational culture deals with different ways of thinking. So as we go through the rest of this lunchtime webinar, we want to be asking the question, in multiple ways, do you listen to the foxes in your organization? Is there a place for that sort of methodical, sort of slower, more meticulous thinking inside of your organization? And how does that happen? And how does that get connected to the places where decisions are made? So as a way to start looking at different characteristics of a data culture, there's probably one caveat, one warning that we want to issue first, and that is to sort of make sure that we're addressing a major assumption that I certainly run into when we start talking about helping people become data-driven. And that is that we have no interest in making a nation of cyborgs who are controlled by robots. That a lot of people will sort of hear data-driven and think, okay, the computer is going to tell me what to do, and I will just have to sort of give away all freedom of thought. And that is maybe the farthest thing from the truth. It actually is going to require a lot more critical thought and a lot more like creativity in thinking to really, truly take a data-driven approach. So that's the first myth that we want to make sure that we dispel before we start talking about what a data-driven culture is that very large one of what it is not. And you'll notice as we walk through this really like 4 basic pieces of a data-driven culture that they're very human characteristics, right? So the first one we have here is curious. So I'm thinking a culture is curious when you start with a set of questions, right? You don't start with, all right, what are the requirements for information that I have to collect? And I will just sort of cross my T's and dot my I's and meet my requirements for measurement. It's really the mindset that there are answers out there, but that we don't have them all, right? But there is an answer out there, and we can pursue that and ask questions to pursue it, right? So whereas a compliance approach might tend to say, well, the answer out there is complying with all of the existing measurements that exist, right? So if it's not an NQF approved measure, it must not be worth measuring, right? So that's, and if that was true, you know, presumably our system would be fixed already because we're measured as much as we were measuring those things. So it's obviously false if we sit back and think about it, but a curious approach to data and to the work that your organization is doing requires that these questions sort of be put out there. The other thing that's worth saying about curiosity here is that it's persistent curiosity. It's not curiosity that's sort of going after the shiny new thing that comes up. It's having a question and seeing that question through to the end, through multiple phases of refining the question until you actually have an answer to the question in hand. So that's our first sort of major pillar of what it is to be a data culture.
Josh, I would just add to that that it's not curiosity for curiosity's sake.
Right.
Because sometimes we hear that when someone asks a data analyst for data, and the data analyst rightly says, what would you do with that information
Yes.
if I did answer that great question? And the response is, I'm just curious.
Yeah.
That's not really what we're suggesting is a characteristic of a data culture. That's
No, in fact, and it's not curiosity about the data so much as it is curiosity about the change that the organization can make in the world. And that's a really crucial difference, right? So data is one way of helping to answer that question, what can this organization do? I mean, an organization is sort of a pool of resources that can make some difference in the world, right? Any organization that exists really, essentially can be boiled down to that. And the curiosity comes in asking the question of what is the difference we're going to make in the world, and how do we make sure that we're actually making that difference? Yeah, so it has to be tied to action. Otherwise, it ends up being sort of it's like a hamster wheel exercise.
Yes,
where you're
engrossed
just,
curiosity.
yeah.
Thank you.
So the next pillar of sort of a data culture is humility, is being humble. And it's almost something that, like, as I'm putting it on a slide, I'm like, well, wait, that's almost like, you know, I mean, that's a very human characteristic. And it's interesting to note that Google, for instance, has humility as one of the things that it explicitly looks for when it's hiring. And it's not because, you know, of some sort of moral precept. It's because when you have people who have a humble approach to the work that they're doing, there are a myriad of results that come from that sort of approach to work. Right? So these are sort of the output. These are the characteristics that flow from this humble approach, or this humble characteristic of data culture. The first is that there's an approach on becoming right and not being right. If you think about the difference between those two things, right? So if people are invested in being right, they're invested in defending their current point of view. They're invested in, and usually there's territorialism, there's sort of fear involved there. Whereas if you're invested in becoming right, you can do that together with other people. And being wrong about one thing is a learning opportunity, not sort of an opportunity to be brought out in front of your peers for public ridicule. So there's a really critical difference there. In both cases, you believe that there's an answer. There is something that you can do that's better, but the answer is not you as you are today, and there's growth required. Also, there's the ability to acknowledge that, surprise, surprise, not everyone is great at everything all the time. Not a big surprise when we say it out loud, but a lot of times that's sort of the expectation that people put out there for themselves and for others. The third aspect of this sort of humility is, and this is sort of flows out from approaching people consistently and without unnecessary hierarchy in an organization, where you're really giving data to anyone who needs it within the bounds of what's legal, right? So as long as access to data is legal, you're making it available to anybody who needs it to the maximum amount that they can use it and that they need it for decision making. This is also the kind of characteristic of a culture where people can ask basic questions without fearing that they will appear to be dumb, right? So you can ask really basic questions like, why are we measuring this to begin with? Or, well, what sort of decision should that lead me to, right? And really expect an answer and expect some sort of dialogue from that, and not just sort of knowing stares from across the table. And finally, a culture that's built on humility promotes trust. And I think it's Stephen Covey wrote a book called The Speed of Trust. And I think there's something really sort of profound about that organizations can't move faster than the speed of trust, is sort of a paraphrase of his thesis there, that a lot of what bogs people down is not inefficiency in process, it's a lack of trust between different people in an organization.
One thing I just wanted to point out is already you can see how these things build on each other or coexist.
Yep.
So if you're naturally or operating out of a sense of humility as an organization, you're going to also then naturally be curious about, if I'm not great at this, who is great? It seems like one kind of builds on the other.
Right.
So.
And you'll tend to ask those questions and not fear going out there and finding people who sort of complement your weaknesses.
Right.
Yeah. So the last thing to note here in under humility is that this, while it's a very human trait, it's also really a characteristic of how science gets done. Like if you think about how scientific knowledge gets created, it's by teams. And while we might have the idea in our head of so on our left over here we see Isaac Newton, like the lone scientific genius. If you really look at the scientific research that comes out, the vast majority of it is teams of multiple people. I mean, so many people that you don't even want to cite all of their names when you're citing the article, and you just write et al. Because it's inherently a team approach that is growing scientific knowledge, and that's not really different than how knowledge grows at an organization. The next characteristic is testing. And by this, I mean sort of two different types of testing. So the first is sort of the more formal testing, where you're testing your performance. you're saying, for like, let's say that you have implemented a new evidence-based practice. If you've implemented this evidence-based practice, the hedgehoggy approach is going to say, well, it's evidence-based. I guess I can implement it everywhere. I'm for evidence-based practices, so let's implement evidence-based practices, and that's a great idea.
And I have confidence that the outcome that I'll achieve is the same as the evidence suggests.
Right. And note that hedgehogs don't have bad ideas, right? This is actually a really good idea to implement evidence-based practices. The issue is that it's applied everywhere uniformly. So testing here would involve not just sort of saying, yes, we're going to implement evidence-based practices, but then continuing to ask, all right, are the promises of this practice, right? So this practice said that it would achieve these outcomes. Is that true here in my environment? Is it true in both, with this particular program and this particular program, regardless of who manages it? Is it true now, 3 years into the process, as opposed to at implementation, right? And this is really just the basic premise of replication, right? Like, we don't just want to know, did something work once in one condition? We want to know if it continues to work, because ultimately what we're trying to create is something that actually works for the people who we are serving. The other kind of testing is not so much the formal kind of testing, but just continuing to test our assumptions. So being skeptical about data as it's presented. And by being skeptical about data, I don't mean saying this data is no good, therefore we're not going to use any data, right? So it's not trying to sort of short-circuit a data-driven approach. But it's realizing that data is going to tell you some things, but you're going to have blind spots in what you're measuring. And being intelligent about, and just thoughtful about what those blind spots are, is critical to an approach, right? So here we see, so if you went to Google right now, and you Googled GPS and a cliff, you would find multiple examples of people who have driven off of cliffs because they're listening to their GPS, right? So the GPS here is the data, but you obviously have other data coming into your eyes through the windshield, and if you focus too much on one thing and sort of neglect common sense and other indications to the contrary, well, the analogy here, at least, is you might not drive off of a cliff, but your organization may drive off of a proverbial cliff. The last sort of pillar of this data culture that we're talking about here is that it's adaptive, that it actually uses the information that it gathers, it uses its knowledge to make real changes, right? So over on the left, we have some examples of things that I know that you guys have probably done in your organizations, right? So if you increased staffing based on show or no-show rates, if you change the way that scheduling is done, that's an actual tactical, procedural change that you're making based on information that you've gathered. The same, if you decrease spending on budgets based on, like, if productivity is low for a year and you're not going to recoup a certain amount of money, decreasing budgets is a way of adapting to that measure. If you implement fault protocol or any sort of quality improvement process based on a noted sort of gap in performance, again, it's another place that you are hearing about a fact that is measured as data and you're making a change based on that. And that's something that everybody's aware of. Here's sort of a throwback to one of our previous presentations. And this really looks at not just whether you are adaptive, but the degree to which you can be adaptive, right? So at level 0, you just have resources. And this is one that I continually just want to sort of beat the drum on, that if you have not allocated resources to doing analysis, And by resources, I mean time, I mean human resources, I mean technological resources. If you haven't allocated resources to doing those things, it's really, it's not likely that you're going to get to levels 1, 2, or 3. I mean, that's sort of the price of entry is the availability of resources to do this sort of work and this sort of thinking. And then we move on from there. So we move on to the ability to actually use those resources to make changes based on analysis, all the way up to integrating analysis into strategy on a really dynamic and fluid basis. And so those were the tenets, well, not so much tenets as like the characteristics of a strong data culture. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the roles, like who's the cast of characters here, who's doing this work, who are the people who have these characteristics, right? So if the characteristics are the adjectives, this cast of characters here are the proper nouns, right? These are the people who are doing the work. And it doesn't necessarily mean that one person is always one of these roles, but that people fill these different roles throughout their work, right? So first we have the analyst, the data science, the person who speaks the language of data, over here under Sprechen data. And this is the role which really sort of designs data collection, makes sure that the data is good and that it's valid, and then translates the data that you collect into something that can be used by somebody who has to make a decision. Also in the organization you have sort of the behaviorist. The behaviorist is the person who gets what's often referred to as sort of the political climate of the organization, who gets to the implication of, let's say, like a particular measure or measurement on the perception of others in the organization, and understands what sort of effects that's going to have on morale, on interpersonal relationships, etc. The third role that we have here is the anthropologist. This person is sometimes sort of referred to as the organizational historian, the person who sort of knows what things have worked and what things have not worked when they've been implemented in the past, and who understands the local context of decisions that are made and changes that are made. Then we have the champion. The champion is really the person who you will rarely find in their office, and who's sort of going around sort of catalyzing change and keeping a project or a particular approach going throughout the organization. And this might be somebody with sort of vested with some authority in the organization by title. It might also just be somebody who really takes on that role of catalyzing others and sort of sparking them to continue to do the work that they're doing. And lastly, you have the designer. So the designer role is really turning the knowledge that is being gained and turning the organizational culture and its other strengths into a product that eventually gets delivered to the consumer. So in this case, it would be the person who's building new programs, who's designing, let's say, a new clinic and setting that up in a certain way, who is deciding where to build a facility and how to build the environment of that facility so that it can be as effective as possible. So all that sort of stuff would go into the designer role. And all of these, so on the bottom we have the generalist, all of these can happen to different extents within the same person, right? So you often have multiple of these strengths that they're using.
And I think this is a helpful way for us to think about our organizations, that our organizations are evolving in terms of how to become data cultures, and this is a nuanced evolution from, I guess, the language we used to use, where we would say, well, on any project you need a content expert, or a clinician, and a data or IT expert. It kind of used to be make sure both are in the room. So I think that this really expands that thinking and saying it's not just the role they fill in the organization, but what people do you have that would fill all of these various roles? Because really, to become a data culture, you need to think beyond just content experts and then who formats that data. But it's much more nuanced than that. And I think we've seen this, and part of this was developed out of projects that we've seen be less than maybe ultimately successful. And you realize later, wow, we really missed that anthropologist. We made a significant change without the context of why we were doing something the way we were doing. And without that, we made a change, lost that, and saw a failure or a less than optimal result. Yes. And also just thinking about that, it's not as simple as what role you play in the organization, but everyone can develop some of these traits and fill some of these roles.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing that's very purposefully absent from this is the decision maker, right? There's ultimately somebody who has to decide to allocate resources into, and that really is based on all the different work and feedback that's coming from this. Some of that's hard data. Some of that is just a knowledge of the climate of the organizational culture. Some of that is community relationships. I mean, there are a lot of different things that go into a quality decision being made. And it really does involve this whole sort of spectrum of skills and roles.
Mm-hmm. I think the other thing we want to clarify here is that doesn't mean that in every meeting or every decision you need to like look around the room and make sure that every one of these roles is filled at every table. What we're saying is you need to think about in an organization, are all of these characters present to some degree or another, and are you thinking about the value that they bring to the final product? And at some point in a process, you need to make sure that those folks' voices are heard.
Yeah. So not so much in reference to like meetings, like, hey, let's check off all of our boxes of are these people like champion present, check, right. Designer present, check. Like right. That's not what we're advocating. It's much more that when the organization's making a really critical decision, that for those decision points, especially when there's like a major investment going on of time or money, that you really are involving this sort of approach.
And I think the other piece is that all of these have value. And you could make arguments about the relative value of each of these, but I think where we're coming from is sometimes the anthropologist, I think this one in particular sticks in my mind, gets kind of labeled as like, they're the one who always wants to just stick with, this is how we've always done it, and seen as maybe obstructionist towards change, and instead viewing that as a really valuable role in the change process. Like, let's not lose some things that are working, or it might be a compliance standard that we can't lose sight of, or whatever that is. They're actually a really valuable part of a change process.
Yeah.
Not a, let's hold back and not change because we've always done it. But maybe there's a piece of this that you folks have forgotten that we need to hold on to.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of change process, so a change process is really what all of this is moving toward. So we said before, like we have the characteristics of data culture, and those are sort of the adjectives, right? And if the characters are the nouns, we need this to turn into something, right? We need some action to happen. We need to turn this not to just be an exercise in labeling and getting people in the right places, but in actually accomplishing something together, right? So these roles are meant to interact, and culture is more than just an org chart, right? So more than just having checkboxes, designer, present. More than just making sure that you sort of have the right labels on the org chart, it has to work together. And that's where everything always gets complicated, as you know. Right? So it's not just about having the data. It's not even just about, and there are some helpful things about sort of making data a standard part of everyday work. It's not just about that, right? There are a lot of other issues, like who controls the data? Are the people who do analysis of data inside of the IT department, Or are they on the program side? Are they, like, who is supervising them? How do they choose what to work on? Like, what's the process for them getting requests for new analyses? So all of those things, which are not about having data, they're about how an organization is structured and how it makes decisions. All of those things are critical aspects to feeding this sort of a data-driven approach in your organization's culture.
Just a simple analogy from the behavioral health world, or maybe it's a metaphor, you can correct me which one it is, but it reminds me a bit of like an ACT team. And you still may have official roles, like there's a nurse who has a particular role or position, you have a social worker, but they're all learning together how to be an ACT team, so the lines get a little more blurred than a traditional organization or a traditional I-team kind of structure. So I think that's really what we're trying to promote here, is an organizational culture that, yeah, you still may have some specialty skills and that's your assigned role in the organization, but the information transfer is much more fluid than maybe in our traditional systems.
Yeah, and some of that's just that information transfer tends to be more fluid when you have more of it.
Yes.
Right. When it becomes much more a part of doing business every day, it becomes a part of the language, and that I think is another sort of softer but necessary change is, as you use data, coming to common language and understanding about what something means, right? Because eventually everybody's using shorthand when they talk to each other. Like when somebody says productivity, they mean what comes out of a very specific equation as it is implemented at their company, right? So all of this stuff enters into sort of everyday conversation and decision making. That's a lot less formal, but that requires learning together. So here, so once we take the roles as they were sitting, in their nice neat row before, and we sort of throw them in and say, all right, how do these different things relate to each other, right? So just to look at some examples. So you have analysts and you have the anthropologist or the organizational historian. Does the analyst work closely with that anthropologist, with that other person, to ask whether old mistakes are being repeated, to ask what caused those mistakes in the past, and if it's possible to include those as part of the measurement or as part of the analysis? Do people designing programs use available data to help develop their implementation? So something even as simple as, like, let's say you're building a new access center and you want to build it in the part of the city where people have the most need. Are you looking at, whatever available public data there is? Are you looking at crime mapping reports? Are you looking at, the available data on ER visits at specific ERs inside of your community? Those things are out there, but people aren't always using them to design the programs that they are building. Another example, so the analysts working together with the behaviorists. There are lots of ways to present data in a way that is accurate, but is totally insensitive to its audience, right? So do analysts understand the impact of how they're presenting data based on the audience who's receiving it? I mean, and that's something that, while they can be completely right about the facts, the way that it is said can have a huge impact on whether it actually gets traction and whether change really occurs. And both sides of that are really important to consider together. So now we're going to sort of sit back and put on our objectivity hats and try to take a look at our own organizations and walk through these characteristics of data culture as a way of assessing our own respective organizations.
And I think it's important when we think about assessing our organizations that this is like, I think most organizations have some capacity to be a data culture, a positive data culture. So this isn't really about like, theoretically, could we be that kind of organization? Just like when you're assessing for whether somebody has competencies, a skill or an ability is only a competency if it's demonstrated, if it's observable. Do you actually see this in action? So we're not asking, for example, do we have the capacity to be curious? Because we're going to trust that we all actually have that capacity.
Yeah.
But what we're asking is, like, how often do we see that demonstrated? Or how frequently do I see that in a day or in a week? How many of our committees structure and function this way?
Yeah.
So the assessment is really more about, am I observing this, not hypothetically, does this capacity exist?
Right. I mean, you may be a very curious person and really have a lot of questions, but if you, as part of your day-to-day work, don't have the time or really outlet to use that curiosity in the service of your organization and its mission and vision, that, you know, that would be a place where, while yes, the capacity is certainly there, it's not being manifest, right? It's not actually coming out and happening.
So that's one thing we want to think about when we're saying assessing. We're saying assessing for the actual delivery of some of these characteristics. Are you actually observing them? And then also, are these things tolerated? Well, first of all, are they punished? Because we have seen organizations where some of these traits are actually punished. It's not a safe, it's not a trusting environment, so it's a punishing environment. Some that are tolerant of this kind of behavior and culture, and some that are promoting it. So kind of the scales that you use when we're asking these questions are really up to you. If you want to think of them in a frequency scale, if you want to think of them as accepting versus punishing. This isn't a scientific assessment by any means.
Yeah.
It's some ways to think about your organization.
We opted not to go with like a fake, non-valid, non-reliable Likert scale. So we just asked these as yes or no sort of questions for reflection and, you know, subjective assessment. Just sort of a gut check for you guys to sort of run against your personal experiences. So for curiosity, for instance, do your committees, do your teams continually generate questions and wait around to find the answers, right? Like, do you have a set of things that you're like, we really want to know the answers to these, and where you, if you do know the answers, that you continue to come back to them and see if they've changed, and where you don't know them, where you keep track of what those questions are and don't just let them fall by the wayside as hypotheticals, but really dive in and, you know, persist to figure out what the answer is. Also, do you question whether the metrics that you do use are enough or whether they're the right metrics? So there's lots of times where like somebody will, you know, let's say implement a dashboard, right? And because this is not easy work, because it can take a long time and a lot of effort to implement a dashboard, people will sort of sit there, look at their existing dashboard and be like, well, I don't know if we really have enough time or energy to add new things. I guess we should just go with what's on the dashboard. Or if a question really isn't useful, but I have the data and I have the reports, do I have the courage to say, you know what, that data just isn't useful anymore. It's not a question I need to ask. Like, do we manage the things that we have to look at and prune those in order to keep them healthy? So next, humble. So here, we want to know, you know, do people ever do research into who's doing this better, right? Is there the assumption that we are the best at doing this because because we've gotten some positive feedback on satisfaction surveys, or, you know, because we have, we have a manager who's awesome and who really treats her employees well, or are we continually asking, who's doing this better? How can we learn from similar efforts that are going on in other places so that we can continue to improve? Also, do your leaders admit when they've made specific suboptimal decisions? And I say suboptimal here instead of bad, because nobody has a crystal ball, right? So the question is not, did you do something that happened not to work? It's more that, like, did you make a decision in a way that was sort of a knee-jerk decision and didn't take into account even the facts that you did have available to you? And can people admit that? Can people sort of come out and say, yes, this very specific instance, I made a mistake, and this is how we're going to fix it? The testing part of the culture. So do you actually craft the questions that you're asking before going to the data? Right, so the analogy here would be the difference between, like let's say you were building a house. Would you start by going to Home Depot and finding all of the parts, or would you start with a blueprint? And asking questions and really crafting and refining exactly what you're trying to ask. And this is something we're doing in Data Lab all the time, sort of saying, all right, what is the actual question that we want to ask before we dive in and look at the data? Because the data can be really overwhelming and not particularly helpful for the decision that we're trying to make. And then finally, for testing, have you ever found out that an innovation that you made was not successful? Right? So let's say something came along, everybody was really gung-ho about it, implemented it. Have you had the courage and sort of the testing capability set up to say, you know what, this did not work. We really hoped it would, but it didn't work.
Yeah, an example of that would be, do all of your pilots always turn into full-blown programs, or do some of your pilots fail? And you say that was not a successful pilot. We should not implement this further. Or is pilot really just always mean phase one of full implementation?
Yeah.
It's kind of one of those checks for me to say, are we truly testing our hypotheses?
Yeah, that's a good and common example. Finally, on the adaptive characteristic, we want to know, all right, do you ever stop a practice or make drastic changes based on the results that you see? Right? If you are seeing that performance is going down in a particular area, do you actually invest your time and resources in making a change to that? Do you change staffing patterns based on data that's coming in, et cetera?
Yeah, I think for me, this one is about organizational culture, and sometimes what you hear is the only time we stop doing something is when the funding stops for that thing. It's much more driven by funding than it is outcome or performance. And that would be, again, just a telltale sign that maybe you're not truly being an adaptive organization if the only time you stop something is because it's no longer funded, regardless of how effective that service was.
Yeah. And then the last one we have on here, and this is something that, so you're not going to know all of the risks that are coming along tomorrow from your data. This is a place where strategy really does sort of meet with existing measurements and existing data and analysis, sort of an outward-looking view from the organization and also an internal view that looks at quality improvement and operations. So the question here is, are you measuring your organization based on really today's risks or yesterday's risks or tomorrow's risks, right? Are you still thinking about productivity, for instance, as a fee-for-service sort of, right, where it's my clinician does this much work, that gives me this much money, and are you thereby sort of perpetuating a lot of what people are saying is the problem with the healthcare system, where it's what's incentivized is volume and not value? Or are you trying to think forward into the future and saying, all right, we are going to start right now looking at whether we have any risk based on this value-based way of thinking, and we're going to try to prepare for that. So we wanted to end with a call to some action, or at least an invitation to consider making some changes, right? So one of the big go away, take home messages here is inviting data to the places where decisions are made. And like I said, like that does not mean becoming cyborgs. It doesn't mean, you know, if the number comes out at over 81, you must make this decision. But it means thinking about your decisions in the light of existing facts. And so our example here is, I guess another way we could talk about bringing data to decisions is bringing Mr. Spock to the deck, right? So Captain Kirk in Star Trek is never without Mr. Spock on the deck. He's sitting there right next to the decision maker. He has complete knowledge of the context that the decision has to be made in, and yet he's approaching it from the lens of logic and analysis. And Kirk never goes anywhere without him, as you may recall from the Wrath of Khan, Star Trek Part 2. So that's sort of our first takeaway here. Second is to value different people's interpretations of data, right? So a good example here, I think I just mentioned sort of productivity standards. If the only way we think about productivity is as a weapon to beat clinicians with, right? Like you are not meeting your hourly expectations, and you're not bringing the people who are accountable for performance to the table to help you interpret the data, you're going to miss out on a lot. I mean, in that particular instance, let's say that a program manager starts purchasing lots of sort of making lots of large capital expenses for a program, and the productivity of that program cannot, like just physically cannot make up for all of those purchases. That's something that you'd want to know, and that you'd probably figure out if you were talking to the clinicians themselves. So really, it kind of goes back to the sort of person-centered planning mantra of nothing about me without me, where if you're accountable for meeting a measure, you're at the table discussing how to interpret that measure.
Right, and I think the folks that are actually doing the work are just such a key stakeholder in any data discussion. They can inform the assumptions you're making. You know, how did you arrive at that denominator to do a productivity calculation? Yep. And sometimes their input into, you know what, that's really not even a feasible denominator. Right. Did you consider that you've also required me this week to do X, Y, and Z? Yep. So, right, there is not actually even time in my week for that denominator to be a reality. And sometimes those assumptions there needs to be an opportunity to challenge assumptions in a safe environment.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Making data a part of a regular meeting agenda, and I know that most people would not characterize themselves as needing more meetings to go to, and I would not argue with them. So when we're talking about meetings, some of what we're talking about is changing the way that meetings are done. The way that a lot of organizations are sort of moving towards having meetings are having stand-up, like literally standing meetings. So the meeting lasts as long as you can physically stand or less. So these are like half-hour or less meetings, and there's a standard agenda that you're running through, and you're saying, all right, we want to make sure we hit all of these things, that we get all of our questions out there and all of our action items out there, and then we're going to stop meeting and we're going to go and do those action items and meet back fairly frequently. So you're having frequent meetings, but they're really short and they're really purpose-driven. And they're better for you physically, and you're less likely to get pressure sores because you're not sitting down. And then finally, that's a HEDIS measure?
Yes, yeah. Pressure sores, yeah. Yes. It's important that we don't promote those.
So finally, interacting with information, right? If you're sitting in a meeting and you're sort of seeing a whole group of people just sort of being passive recipients of information, right? So I'm running through the elements on my dashboard and I just see like people's eyes are glazed over, and all they're trying to do is not to have the data used as a weapon against them and just being quiet. This is not what we're talking about. So this is not where we want to be. Active engagement with data, and that means, again, questioning what that data means, questioning the implications of it, and whether action is required, and if so, what action is required. Taking notes, looking at the data ahead of time and coming to the meeting with circled and scrawled on documents where you're really looking at results that you think are interesting and potentially important to discuss as a group. That sort of level of active engagement with data is really a hallmark of a data culture. So those are our handful of to-do items, and we are at the end of our hour. It was great, once again, speaking with all of you. Thank you for taking the time to join us in the middle of what we know is a really busy day, and just taking the time to sort of think through the larger implications and needs of this change that we are collectively going through throughout the system.
Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks, I believe.
That is true. All right, we will see you then, and goodbye.
Have a great day.